High in the rugged landscape of southeastern Turkey, there is a ridge that, for most of history, attracted no attention at all. It looked ordinary. Limestone, dust, broken stone, the kind of terrain archaeologists had learned to ignore. For decades, surveys passed over it without hesitation, cataloged as nothing more than a natural rise in the land, a barren hill shaped by time, erosion, and chance. And yet, today, that same ridge is forcing historians to reconsider some of the most basic assumptions about early human history. Because this hill was not natural. What if one of the most important sites in human history was never hidden by secrecy, only by familiarity? What if the greatest discoveries aren't buried in mystery, but in plain sight? In the early 1990s, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt stood on this ridge overlooking the Heron Plain. Where others had seen scattered flint and broken limestone, Schmidt noticed patterns, shapes that didn't follow geology, but intention. Subtle symmetry, repetition, geometry, the kind that doesn't occur by accident. Beneath the soil, something artificial was waiting. When the first excavations began, the ground revealed the top of a massive stone pillar. Not rough, not crude, but carefully carved. Precise, squared, deliberate. As more earth was removed, more stone emerged. Pillars, walls, enclosures, entire structures, buried intentionally beneath layers of fill. This was not a settlement. This was not a village. And it was not supposed to exist according to everything we thought we knew. For generations, the story of civilization followed a simple logic. Humans hunted, then farmed, then built. Food first, cities later, monuments last. It was believed that large-scale construction required agriculture, surplus, and stable societies, that you could not have temples without farms or engineers without villages. But here, on this ridge, massive stone structures were appearing in a period when humans were still classified as hunter-gatherers. No evidence of farming, no domesticated animals, no permanent housing, no agricultural infrastructure, only stone. Gigantic stone pillars, some weighing over 15 to 20 tons, shaped and positioned with care. Structures that required planning, coordination, and sustained effort, appearing thousands of years before farming was supposed to exist. This doesn't prove anything on its own, but it raises a difficult question. How does a society without agriculture organize the labor, knowledge, and logistics to build monuments? And perhaps more importantly, why would they? This wasn't survival architecture. These weren't shelters. They weren't defensive walls. They weren't homes. They were something else entirely. Some researchers argue these structures represent early ritual spaces. Others suggest they reflect social organization built around shared belief rather than shared food systems. The debate remains unresolved. But one thing is clear. This site does not fit comfortably into the traditional timeline of human development. And that discomfort is important. Because history isn't just shaped by what we find, it's shaped by what we expect to find. And sometimes, discoveries matter not because they answer questions, but because they quietly expose how incomplete our questions were to begin with. Before we go further, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there right now? And as you're listening to this story, ask yourself, does this feel like an exception or the beginning of a much larger pattern? Let me know your perspective in the comments. Quiet Evidence is about understanding history together, not defining it for you. If the structures buried beneath this ridge were unusual, the dates attached to them were something else entirely. When researchers began analyzing organic material recovered from the deepest layers of the site, the expectation was modest. Most assumed the remains would place construction somewhere near the early Neolithic, perhaps close to the emergence of farming communities in the region. What the results revealed was deeply unsettling. Carbon dating placed the earliest construction phases around 9,600 BCE. That date is not just old. It is disruptive. To understand why, we need to pause and picture the world at that moment in time. The planet was emerging from the final stages of the last ice age. Vast portions of the northern hemisphere were still shaped by glacial memory. Sea levels were lower. Britain was not yet an island. Large Ice Age mammals had not fully disappeared. Human populations were sparse, mobile, and widely believed to be technologically limited. According to conventional models, people at this time lived in small, nomadic groups. They relied on stone tools, seasonal hunting, and temporary shelters. The wheel had not been invented. Metalworking was thousands of years away. Agriculture, as a stable system, did not yet exist. And yet, here we have carefully carved limestone pillars, some weighing as much as small trucks, arranged into complex enclosures. This doesn't automatically overturn established history, but it does strain it. The standard explanation for monumental architecture has long depended on agricultural surplus. Farming creates food storage. Food storage allows population growth. Population growth enables specialization, builders, planners, leaders. Under this model, monuments appear only after societies settle down. But these structures appear before that entire chain begins. This raises an uncomfortable question. If farming did not create monument-building societies, what did? Some researchers suggest that social complexity may have existed independently of agriculture, that shared belief systems, seasonal gatherings, or ritual obligations could have organized large groups temporarily, without permanent settlement. Others remain cautious, pointing out that absence of agricultural evidence does not necessarily mean absence of early experimentation with cultivation. The archaeological record is incomplete, and preservation is selective. Still, the timeline problem remains. These constructions were not small-scale experiments. They required planning across years, possibly generations. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and erected with precision. This implies forethought, leadership, and cooperation on a scale that challenges how we define hunter-gatherer. It also challenges the idea that human innovation follows a clean, upward slope. What if history isn't a straight line from simple to complex? What if complexity appears, fades, and reappears, shaped by environment, climate, and circumstance rather than steady progress? This period coincides closely with a major climatic event, the end of a long cold phase marked by instability and sudden environmental shifts. During such times, survival usually takes priority. Yet here, enormous energy was invested in something that offered no obvious material benefit. That contradiction is difficult to ignore. It suggests these structures served a purpose that went beyond shelter or subsistence, something symbolic, social, or psychological. Something capable of motivating people to gather, work, and persist despite uncertainty. As we move forward, the question is no longer just how these structures were built, but why this moment in time was chosen to build them at all. As you think about this timeline, does it challenge how you imagine early human societies? Do you see this as an exception, or a sign that our definitions may be too narrow? Share how this part changes, or doesn't change, your perspective. And as always, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see how far this story travels. If the timeline unsettles us, the engineering deepens the unease. Standing inside the stone enclosures, one detail becomes immediately clear. This was not improvised construction. The pillars are not randomly placed, nor are they simply leaned into position. They are set with intention, aligned, balanced, and integrated into the bedrock beneath them. In several cases, the bases of the pillars are carved directly from the living rock, creating sockets that lock each stone into place. This is not the work of people experimenting. It looks like the work of people who already knew what they were doing. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Where did this knowledge come from? The pillars themselves are monumental. Some rise more than 5 meters high. Others weigh well over 15 tons. Even with modern equipment, moving stone of this size across uneven terrain is a serious logistical challenge. Yet here, these blocks were quarried nearby, transported uphill, shaped, and erected, all without metal tools, wheels, or domesticated animals. We often imagine ropes, rollers, and manpower as a simple explanation. But when researchers examine the terrain, that explanation begins to feel incomplete. The ridge is steep, the ground uneven. Limestone fractures easily under stress. A single miscalculation could ruin weeks or months of labor. And yet, failure is surprisingly rare. This suggests planning, not just strength, but coordination. Someone had to calculate angles. Someone had to decide where each pillar belonged. Someone had to enforce consistency across structures built over long periods of time. That implies leadership and memory, and instruction passed from one group to the next. What we don't see is just as important. There are no nearby living quarters, no permanent homes, no hearths filled with domestic debris. The people who built these enclosures did not appear to live here. They came, they built, and they left, which leads to another possibility. Some researchers suggest these were not villages, but destinations, places people traveled to. Seasonal gathering sites where groups from different regions converge to work, perform rituals, exchange knowledge, or reaffirm shared beliefs. If that interpretation is correct, then the engineering becomes even more impressive. Coordinating hundreds of people, possibly thousands, without centralized cities or written language requires social systems we don't normally associate with this period. It also requires motivation. You don't move mountains of stone for convenience. You do it for meaning. And meaning, unlike food, doesn't leave easy traces in the ground. What we see instead is precision, symmetry, repetition, design choices that suggest these structures matter deeply to the people who built them, not as shelters, but as statements. Statements carved into stone. As we examine the layout more closely, another pattern begins to emerge, one that challenges the idea of gradual learning. The earliest structures are not the simplest. In fact, they are often the most ambitious. Larger pillars, finer carving, more complex arrangements. Later constructions become smaller, more restrained, less detailed. That reversal raises a difficult question. Were these people developing new skills here, or were they preserving the last echoes of an older tradition? Because if this knowledge wasn't invented on this ridge, then it had to exist somewhere else first. And that brings us to the stones themselves, and what they were chosen to say. At this point in the story, how do you imagine the builders? As small groups cooperating temporarily, or as part of something more structured? Share your interpretation in the comments. I read them closely, and they often shape how we explore the next part. When you're ready, we'll move into. If the engineering reveals how these structures were built, the carvings hint at why. Up close, the stone surfaces are anything but plain. Animals emerge from the limestone in high relief. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds of prey. Their bodies curve naturally around the pillars, following the contours of the stone as if the images were already waiting inside, long before they were carved free. This was not decorative filler. It was intentional communication. Each figure required extraordinary patience. The sculptors removed centimeters of hard limestone to leave forms standing proud in 3 dimensions. This is not a technique that allows for improvisation. One mistake, one poorly placed strike, and the entire pillar could fracture beyond repair. The consistency of these carvings across multiple enclosures suggests something important. This was not the work of amateurs. These artisans had experience, training, perhaps even specialization, an idea traditionally thought to emerge much later in human history. But what exactly were they trying to communicate? The animals are not random. Many are predators, creatures that inspire fear, respect, or caution. Their repetition across the site suggests shared symbolism, a visual language understood by those who gathered here. Some researchers argue these figures represent mythological beings or clan symbols. Others believe they reflect relationships between humans and the natural world, not as masters, but as participants in a dangerous and unpredictable environment. There are no clear scenes of daily life, no farming, no hunting narratives, no domestic imagery. Instead, the carvings seem to exist outside of time, symbolic rather than practical. And then there are the pillars themselves. Most are shaped like elongated T-forms. This shape appears consistently across multiple structures, across centuries of construction. The proportions are deliberate, the symmetry precise. Several researchers have suggested these pillars may represent stylized human forms, with the horizontal bar acting as shoulders and the vertical shaft as a torso. In some cases, arms and hands are carved along the sides, reinforcing this interpretation. If this reading is correct, then the enclosures were not filled with columns. They were filled with presences. Silent, stone figures arranged in circles, facing inward, surrounding central pillars larger than all the rest. That interpretation does not imply worship in any modern sense. It does not prove religious hierarchy or organized priesthood. But it does suggest that these spaces were built to be experienced, to evoke emotion, memory, or identity. An experience requires participation. This may explain why the site shows little evidence of long-term habitation. People may have come here for specific moments, gatherings that reinforced shared beliefs or marked significant transitions. If so, then the carvings were not meant for outsiders. They were meant for those who already understood their meaning. This raises an important limitation in our interpretation. We can measure stone, we can date charcoal, but we cannot directly access belief. We are decoding a language without a dictionary. And yet, patterns matter. The repetition of symbols across structures suggests continuity, tradition, transmission of ideas over time. These people remembered, and they taught. Which brings us to another question. If these carvings encode meaning, then what sustained the people who created them? How did a society capable of such symbolic complexity survive long enough to build all of this? To answer that, we have to look away from the stone walls and toward the bones beneath our feet. When you see these carvings in your mind, do they feel symbolic or literal to you? Do you think meaning was shared broadly or restricted to a few? Let me know how you interpret these images. Your perspective matters here. Next, we'll move into building stone monuments is only half the challenge. The other half is survival. Every pillar raised on this ridge represents not just labor, but calories, human energy, time taken away from hunting, gathering, and shelter. For decades, researchers focused on how these structures were built. Only later did a deeper question emerge. How were the builders fed? At first glance, the location offers few answers. The ridge has no nearby water source. The soil is thin and rocky. There is no evidence of agriculture, no grinding stones for grain processing, no storage pits, no domesticated plant remains. If large numbers of people gathered here, they could not have lived off the land locally. And yet, they clearly gathered. Excavations revealed tens of thousands of animal bones scattered throughout the site. Most belonged to wild species, especially gazelle, along with aurochs and wild boar. These were not isolated kills. The volume suggests repeated, large-scale hunting events. This was not subsistence for a family. It was provisioning for a workforce. Some researchers propose that seasonal mass hunts supplied the protein necessary to sustain large groups during construction phases. Herd animals could have been driven into natural traps or coordinated kill zones, a strategy known from later hunter-gatherer societies, but rarely on this scale. Such hunts require planning, timing, communication. They also require leadership. Coordinating hundreds of people to hunt, butcher, transport, and distribute meat implies an organizational structure more complex than we usually associate with mobile societies. It suggests temporary but highly efficient systems, mobilized when needed, then dissolved. This challenges the idea that food surplus must always come from farming. Instead, surplus may have come from cooperation. There is another detail worth considering. The bones show signs of feasting rather than daily consumption. Cuts, fractures, and burn marks suggest communal meals, events rather than routines. If construction coincided with these gatherings, then the monuments were not built by isolated workers. They were built during moments of collective participation, where labor, food, and meaning overlapped. Some scholars have suggested that these feasts may have reinforced social bonds or belief systems, motivating people to contribute labor beyond immediate survival needs. Others caution that such interpretations remain speculative. The evidence supports organization. It does not explain intention, but intention matters. Because sustaining this level of activity over centuries requires more than logistics. It requires continuity, a reason for people to return again and again. Even as environments changed, populations shifted, and resources fluctuated. This raises an important possibility. What if these gatherings were not simply practical, but ceremonial? What if food was not just fuel, but part of the message? In many later cultures, communal feasting played a central role in reinforcing identity, hierarchy, and shared memory. It marked transitions. It bound people together. It justified effort. If something similar was happening here, then the stone hills were not just construction sites. They were social engines. And engines require direction. Which leads us to the most unsettling pattern yet. One that only becomes visible when we examine how this site changed over time. Because as the centuries passed, something unexpected happened. The structures didn't improve. They declined. At this stage, does this feel like a society organized by necessity or by belief? Could shared purpose replace agriculture, even temporarily? Share how you see it. Your interpretation helps shape how we approach what comes next. In archaeology, progress usually leaves a trail. When a society develops new skills, we expect to see them improve over time. Tools become more refined, structures more ambitious, techniques more efficient. The earliest layers are often the simplest, the later ones more complex. At this site, that pattern breaks. When researchers examined the stratigraphy, the layered history preserved in soil and stone, they noticed something unsettling. The deepest layers, the oldest constructions, were not crude prototypes. They were the most ambitious, the most carefully executed, and the most visually refined. Massive pillars, high relief carvings, complex circular enclosures. As centuries passed, the architecture became smaller, simpler, less detailed. Later structures used narrower pillars and flatter carvings. The symmetry softened. The ambition narrowed. In other words, the knowledge appears to move in reverse. This does not mean the builders were becoming less intelligent. It does not prove a sudden collapse or catastrophe, but it does raise a difficult question. Why would a culture abandon its most advanced methods? Some researchers suggest practical explanations. Perhaps environmental conditions changed. Resources became harder to access. Population pressures shifted priorities away from monumental construction. Others argue that social structures may have transformed. If leadership systems or belief frameworks weakened, large-scale projects may have become harder to sustain. But even these explanations don't fully resolve the pattern, because the decline is consistent. This wasn't a single failed generation. It unfolded gradually, over many centuries. Each new layer preserved slightly less knowledge than the one before it. That suggests memory loss. Techniques once mastered were no longer fully understood. Skills once common became rare. Designs once precise became approximated. This is not how innovation usually behaves, which leads to an alternative interpretation, one that remains debated but difficult to ignore. What if this site was not a place of invention, but preservation? What if the builders arrived with their highest level of knowledge already intact, and what we are seeing is the slow erosion of a tradition rather than its birth? If that were the case, then the true origin of these techniques lies somewhere earlier, somewhere else, in a time or place we have not yet uncovered. This does not imply a lost civilization in any dramatic sense. There is no definitive evidence of advanced technology beyond what we see here. But it does suggest that human capability may have peaked, declined, and reformed more than once. History may not be a straight line. It may be a series of rises and contractions shaped by climate, mobility, and survival pressures. The timing is significant. These changes occur as the climate stabilized after a long period of unpredictability. As resources became more reliable, the need for massive communal projects may have faded. Social energy may have shifted toward smaller, more localized systems. And then, something even more curious happened. Instead of abandoning the site and walking away, the builders returned, with a purpose not to expand, but to erase. They filled the enclosures deliberately, carefully, methodically. They buried their own work. This was not neglect. It was intention, which brings us to one of the most debated questions in the entire field. Why would a society invest centuries of labor into something, only to hide it from the future? Does this pattern feel like decline to you, or transformation? If knowledge can fade, what does that say about how fragile progress really is? Let me know your thoughts below. We'll need them as we move into the next mystery. If the decline in craftsmanship suggests something was being lost, the final act at this site suggests something even more deliberate. These structures were not abandoned. They were buried. Archaeological evidence shows that each enclosure was carefully filled with tons of material, limestone fragments, stone tools, and animal bone, brought in intentionally from surrounding areas. This was not wind-blown debris. It was not gradual collapse. The fill was clean, deliberate, and systematic. In some cases, the enclosures were packed so tightly that the pillars remained upright, perfectly preserved beneath the surface for millennia. This was an extraordinary effort. To bury a single enclosure would have required almost as much labor as building it in the first place. And yet, this process was repeated again and again across the site, over generations. Why would a society do this? There is no definitive answer. Some researchers argue that the burial was ritual in nature, that these structures had a life cycle. Built, used, retired, and sealed. In this view, covering the enclosures was not destruction, but closure, a way of marking the end of a chapter while preserving its memory. Others suggest environmental explanations. As the climate stabilized and lifestyles changed, these massive communal spaces may no longer have served a practical or symbolic function. Burial could have been a way to neutralize them, to prevent misuse, or to formally disengage from an older belief system. Still others point out that burial protects. By sealing the structures beneath layers of stone and soil, the builders ensured their survival. Wind, erosion, and later human activity could not easily damage what was hidden. Whether intentional or incidental, the result is the same: preservation through concealment. What matters most is what didn't happen. There is no evidence of violent destruction, no burned layers, no smashed pillars, no signs of conflict. Whatever decision was made here, it appears to have been collective and calm. That alone tells us something important about the people involved. They were capable of long-term planning, not just in construction, but in memory. They understood that what they were sealing mattered enough to be protected, even if it was no longer used. This raises a subtle but profound possibility. What if these enclosures were never meant to be permanent gathering spaces? What if they were messages, not just to the present, but to the future? By burying the structures, the builders created artificial hills, quiet containers of knowledge, symbolism, and effort. They did not leave inscriptions explaining their choices. They left questions instead, and questions endure longer than answers. As we widen our focus beyond this single ridge, another pattern begins to emerge. Similar structures, similar symbols, similar architectural choices scattered across the surrounding landscape. This was not an isolated decision made by one group at one time. It appears to have been part of something larger, a regional pattern, a shared understanding. And that shifts the mystery again. Because if multiple communities were involved, then this wasn't just about ending a site. It was about redefining an entire way of life. Why do you think something so monumental would be buried instead of destroyed or abandoned? Does burial feel like forgetting or remembering? Share your thoughts. And if you're watching late at night or early morning, let me know what time it is where you are. These details remind us how far stories like this travel. When we step back from the stone, the dates, and the debates, what remains is not a conclusion, but a challenge. This site does not tell us that everything we know about history is wrong. It does not prove the existence of forgotten empires or lost technologies. There is no definitive evidence for that. What it does is something quieter, and perhaps more important. It reminds us how fragile our assumptions can be. For more than a century, human history has often been framed as a steady climb, from simple to complex, from survival to civilization, from wandering to settlement. It's a story that makes sense. It's orderly. It's easy to teach. But the evidence preserved beneath this ridge resists that simplicity. Here we see organization before agriculture, monumental construction before cities, symbolic language before writing, not as isolated experiments, but sustained, coordinated efforts spanning centuries. This does not mean these people were advanced in a modern sense. They did not leave machines, metals, or written records. But they understood stone. They understood coordination. And perhaps most importantly, they understood shared meaning. That may be the hardest lesson to accept, because meaning does not fossilize easily. We can measure limestone. We can date bone. But belief only survives indirectly, through what people were willing to invest their lives into. And here, people invested enormously. They gathered without permanent homes. They worked without obvious material reward. They preserved what they built by hiding it from the future. Whatever motivated them was powerful enough to organize society, even in the absence of farming, cities, or centralized authority. Some researchers see this as a transitional phase, a moment when belief systems helped create the conditions that later allowed agriculture to emerge. Others remain unconvinced, emphasizing how much we still don't know. The debate remains open, and that openness matters. Because sites like this don't rewrite history, they remind us that history is incomplete, that our timelines are provisional, that the past still holds unanswered questions, waiting quietly beneath the surface. In a way, that makes this story less about ancient people and more about us, about how we define progress, about what we assume must come first, about how much we're willing to reconsider when evidence doesn't fit comfortably. If you've stayed with this story until now, you're already participating in that process. And if you enjoy thoughtful, careful explorations of history like this, not to prove a point, but to ask better questions, consider subscribing to Quiet Evidence. This channel is about slowing down, examining what we know, and respecting what we don't. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Which part of this story stayed with you the most? Did it change how you think about early human societies, even slightly? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them carefully, and they often shape what we explore next. Because history doesn't speak loudly. It whispers. And sometimes, the quietest evidence is the hardest to ignore.